Hi Ellen, thank you so much for coming and meeting me here in Convara. Everybody, this is Ellen Cahill, who, was it last year?
Yep.
Sailed across the Atlantic and back again.
Yeah.
You started sailing quite young. Do you know what your first adventure would have been?
I'm sure my first adventure isn't in my memory really. I grew up in Rossmoney, just down the road from Mayo Sailing Club in County Mayo. My mum and dad were sailors, so I grew up knocking around boats all the time. And I started really properly sailing with Mayo Sailing Club in the junior courses there when I was 8. Yeah, so I grew up sailing a battered old wooden mirror with lots of wooden patches that were repaired by ourselves in evenings after sailing up through the levels in what was the ISA, now Irish Sailing, and then I became an instructor in Mayo Sailing Club and went on to become the senior instructor there when I was 19. So I raced in the club on the Tuesday night dinghy racing with lots of the other kids on the sailing course, and I also did the cruiser racing on Thursday nights. I managed to get myself onto a boat when I was pretty young. I said I'm really good at staying out of the way, so that was my key onto cruiser racing. So that got me on. They couldn't refuse me at that stage.
Sounds like a great sales pitch. I'm good at not getting in the way and I'll do what I'm told, honest.
Yeah, and then I went to university in University College Dublin, and I joined the sailing club there and had a whale of a time. Team racing and did the Student Yachting World Cup with them over in France and in La Rochelle, and then I after college sort of got into a little bit more match racing. So I was really keen on racing. I did, I guess, some club racing down in Mayo Sailing Club, but once I got to university I really caught the bug for racing and was doing any type of racing that I could, big boats, small boats, in between size boats.
And you've recently come back. As we very briefly said at the beginning of our introduction, you sailed across the Atlantic and back again. Tell us a little bit about your route planning on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so we left Ireland in September 2020. So at that stage we were 6 months or so into the pandemic, and we left from Ireland down to northern Spain, Portugal, over to the Canaries, and then over to the Caribbean. Up through the Caribbean chain to the Bahamas, then to across to the Azores, and then we sailed back to Portugal from the Azores, and the boat is down there at the moment. So we did that over a 14-month period. So it was there was 4 main crew involved, myself, my boyfriend Seamus Collins, my cousin Megan Perkins, and a good friend of ours, Niall McAuliffe. So we were a solid team. We spent 2 months working on the boat full time before we left in Westport. So building up to it, we'd done lots of little bits and pieces after work and on weekends, but we took 2 months off before we left to really knuckle down and get all the final bits done, including we put a new engine in the boat. So that was a big job, and various other little bits and standard prep that goes into your route planning, provisioning. How many tins of tomatoes should we buy? How many can we fit? So that 2 months even beforehand really gelled us as a team to deal with the challenges that we faced after that. And one of the key things that we did, and we talked about quite a lot, was how we were going to manage the team in a short space, in a tight space, and when we did face challenges. And I was quite conscious of the fact that I was part of the team, but I was captain who was ultimately responsible. The book stopped with me, but this was my boyfriend, my partner, my cousin of mine who I've been great friends with for years, and a good mate of ours. So we were a team with structure, but at the same time we were a bunch of mates as well, and we had to know how we were going to manage that. So we had a lot of discussions in those 2 months at the start as to how we'd structure things and manage things and make decisions.
Is there anything that any advice you would give to someone else that was planning to sail with family that perhaps had less sailing experience than than you?
Yeah, so I think just not being afraid of having structures. I think people get most frustrated when they don't understand what's expected of them and when they don't understand what's expected of other people. People get frustrated and angry when they don't understand the system and they don't feel it's fair. So I think if you set those guidelines and boundaries and understandings early, you can, everybody still gets unhappy or frustrated at times, but it helps minimize that, I think. So we really did try to sit down and realize what our own responsibilities were, what the boundaries were, so we all understood what was expected of each of us. And that changed as we went on as well.
Tell me, when you have crew on board that have never sailed away from the sight of land before, it can be quite daunting for them, and yet something that quite often an experienced sailor is can't wait for that moment where they can't see land. And then of course you can't wait for the moment when you can see land again, which is all part of the adventure. Can you remember anything that stood out for them, any comments that they made when they saw their first sunrise or realized they couldn't see land?
Yeah, I was looking back at a lot of photos, and we took thousands of photos, as you can imagine. And yeah, you do notice at the start, the photographs, there's a lot of little things that you take for granted, such as sunrises and the endless horizon. And then as the trip goes on, those things become more normal and there's less photos of them as the trip went on. But I think the most exciting element is always seeing land, I think, after a long journey, and you see it and you think, yes, we're there. Of course it takes another 12 hours or so to actually get there and then you have to quarantine for a couple of days, which is happening at the moment, but that's a pretty exciting moment when you see land.
We were chatting earlier and you used the most amazing phrase, I love this, that as a captain and a friend, you didn't want to be the fun sponge. I'm going to use that phrase. I think we all will as skippers on boats when you have your team, is not wanting to be the fun sponge. So thanks for sharing that with us. I think we all know what that means. So in order to avoid being the fun sponge, how did you work your team? How did you bring them on board?
Yeah, so as I said, we had all worked together on the boat for about 2 months before, so that really helped everybody get an idea of what work was and what work wasn't work. And we had work days as we went along, so we'd say, okay, right, tomorrow we're going to do a work day, maybe quite reasonable. We'd have a leisurely breakfast and start work at 10 and take a nice lunch and finish at 4 with a beer. But I find it easier that if we're working, we're all working, and when we're done, we're all done. I'd often get given out to me like, past 4 o'clock, Ellen, put your tools down, get a beer. So it was easier when everybody's involved and everybody's bought into it.
Every sailing trip, adventure, Atlantic crossing can have its challenges. Even sometimes just getting on board the boat can be a challenge. We've gone through one challenge, which is, team, family, overcoming that, sharing responsibilities, which is really important. Did anything go wrong? Were there any challenges that you had to overcome? So you now have your team, you have your boat, you're on the way. Tell us about your adventure and challenges you may have had to overcome along the way.
Yeah, I think the challenges are sometimes what makes it an adventure as well. So I think we had a little bit of a baptism of fire when we left Ireland. So we left from Baltimore in late September, had champagne sailing, beautiful, probably 16 to 18 knots of wind, broad reaching, which I don't know, I feel like we never got to broad reach. The first few, and we were on our way down to northern Spain, to A Coruña. So the first 2 or 3 days, everybody was a little bit seasick, including myself. It hits me more often than I'd like to admit. But so we were about 3 days out, so getting pretty close to northern Spain. A low pressure system came in about 24 hours in advance of what was initially forecasted when we left Baltimore. So we knew we were hitting some weather at the last little stretch. There was an awful lot of traffic. We were dodging ships all over the place, which delayed us a little bit. And then we were getting calls about orcas over the radio. There was a lot of orcas in the area, which some of you may have heard about now at this stage, but this was the early days of the orca attacks. And so there was exclusion zones. So the most direct route into the harbour was an area that we were excluded from going through. So we weren't able to go directly or go the way that we wanted to. So we got pretty delayed, and every little thing delayed us a little bit more. The wind came around onto our nose. And for the last probably 10-12 hours, we had about 60 knots of wind on the nose with pretty steep seas. In hindsight, maybe we should have hove to and stayed out, but everybody was keen to just get in. We were so close. We were within sort of 15 to 20 miles for hours and hours and hours. And we eventually did get in with lots of little minor repairs to be done along the way. Because we had so much wind and such steep waves, we were really slapping down hard and everything started to vibrate. All the shackles that you thought were tight were not tight anymore. So our main sheet came off the boom, our outhaul came off our main, and the last bit in, we were just motoring. We were doing about a knot into the harbour. Just coming in the harbour entrance, the wind had come down a little bit. It was only hitting 50 knots at that stage, but still a lot. We were driving in just on the engine, and we lost power. The engine was still going, but there was no power in it. So I said, okay, we're turning around, we're going out, and everyone said, no, we're so close, we can't leave now. So Shamie and Niall went down to the engine room and very, very quickly copped that the reason that the power was gone was our throttle cable had vibrated off the lever on the engine. So they were able to repair that, and we got into the harbour. And once we were in the harbour, we got a call on the radio from a Scottish guy Dave, who was in the marina there. He was in getting 2 rudders repaired on a brand new catamaran that he was delivering from France. So he had a pretty pretty eventful arrival into A Coruña as well. The orcas had bitten both the rudders off this brand spanking new catamaran, like 60-foot catamaran. Luckily they had 2 engines on the cat, so they were able to maneuver themselves no problem under engine to get in. But yeah, they had two rudders were gone, and they had to get them remade there. So Dave had he called us once we got inside the harbour and said, hey, have you been here before? I said, no, we don't even know if we should attempt to even go into the marina. He said, I put a midships line on, I've got a spot free, I'll guide you all the way in. And we had 3 attempts to get in because it was so breezy. But we got in, and he really saved us that night. It was so nice to have a voice on the radio and know that somebody was going to be able to help us on the other side there. You feel like the journey is all you're done with the major part of the journey, but actually getting into the marina or getting tied up or getting anchored can pose a new challenge at the end then.
And so you said your boat was wet at this stage. So how many days had you been at sea?
We'd only been at sea about 4 days at that stage, but there was so much pounding against the windows that a lot of the seals that we thought were okay weren't really able to withstand it. So we had a lot of Sikaflex repairs to do after that. So we got a fair bit of water, not in any of the hatches really, actually, just some of the permanent side windows that had just leaked in unfortunately to our library, which had to be dried out for days afterwards.
And this is interesting. So this is a really useful lesson for people to perhaps take note of, is that sometimes you can do all the preparation in the world of boat and engine checks and spares and briefing your crew and even going on trial sails out into the harbour on a fine day, but it's not until you're out in a big swell dealing with difficult conditions that you can really see how the boat is holding up. So I guess as a skipper and as crew is it's important to be aware of that and kind of be mentally ready for that shakedown sail.
Yeah, and things to go wrong that you haven't fully thought about or you haven't thought of, and put them in perspective at the time. Yeah, the boat was wet, but we were fine. The boat will dry out again. It's a bit of a pain in the ass, but
yeah, you were safe.
It's a solvable problem.
Yeah.
We had challenges that were far less urgent, but pretty scary at times. crossing the Atlantic. So we left from La Palma in the Canaries, headed for Barbados, and we, at this stage, we picked up a fifth crew member. My cousin Jack Cahill had joined us actually. So there was 5 of us, plenty of crew. We got lots of sleep, and we were on day 10, exactly smack bang halfway across the Atlantic. We had Clonakilty sausages in the oven. A full Irish breakfast was being whipped up in the kitchen. Whipped up, it took a couple of hours. Always took a couple of hours to celebrate our halfway point in terms of nautical miles. Niall was on the bow doing some push-ups actually before the breakfast.
As you do.
as he did sometimes. The rest of us did not do that. We won't admit to that. And he noticed that the forestay chain plate, which was sort of in 2 parts, one half of it had completely severed. It turned out there was crevice corrosion in the stainless steel that hadn't been spotted in the pre-Atlantic crossing rig check that was done, and we had pretty much 50% support left in our forestay, which was it was quite a bit of shock and panic, but there's very little you could do. You're literally as far away from help as you possibly could be at that stage. So I had a chat with Niall, said, look, it is what it is, we'll deal with it, but let's not panic about it, let's not create too much of a fuss. I think I was acutely aware how compromised we were, and if things did get worse, if the situation got worse, we were really, really vulnerable. But I didn't feel the need to really emphasize that or communicate that. There was nothing we could do, so let's not panic about it. Reduce the seriousness and the gravity of the situation. So we were very, very well stocked with spares on the boat. So we had 2 spare bottle screws on board that we were able to shackle to the forestay to give it more support on 2 cleats on the bow. So we stabilised it, and we made a decision to be very conservative, take down our Genoa, not use the Genoa for the rest of the crossing. So it was adversity. It was a challenge, but it was never panic really, because it wasn't imminent danger, I guess. So 2 days later, after we had passed our halfway mark, our engine started to give some trouble. First of all, our starter motor gave up. So we had to take that out and recondition it while we were at sea, which we managed to do. Spent a lot of hours with 3 engineers and quite a few manuals, no Google, fixing that. We got that going again. We were able to charge up our batteries again, and then the seal on our diesel pump went. So we were leaking diesel into the engine room. We discovered it pretty quickly, so we thankfully didn't lose too much diesel. But it was coming out at quite a rate, to the point that we really couldn't use our engine. So for the rest of the trip, we didn't have an engine. We arrived into Barbados just under mainsail and mizzen, and anchored in the bay with just our sails up and no engine. So we spent a lot of hours in that on the second half of that trip, going over different options and debating what was the problem, what could we do, what could we solve. So we were going along slowly enough on our way to Barbados, and we were coming in towards Carlisle Bay, and we called in to the harbour master. Before we had left the Canaries, we understood what the COVID restrictions were at the time, but of course you're at sea for 21 days. At that stage during the pandemic, things were changing weekly. So we didn't know exactly what we'd have to do or what the expectation would be. So we called in and said, look, we're going to come and anchor in Carlisle Bay, and we'll speak to customs and to port authorities and port health. Then they said, negative, you need to come in to the cruise ship terminal, and you can tie up to the cruise ship bollards, which were these gigantic concrete, big massive bollards. I called them back and said, we actually have no engine, so we can't do that. We're gonna anchor in Carlisle Bay instead, and we can get the dinghy across. And they called and said, no, negative, you're not allowed to do that. Every boat has to come in. So rather sort of cheekily, I just said, we can't do that. Discussed among the crew. We can't do that. We're not going to put ourselves in danger and do that. We're not going to get off the boat. So we just called them back and said, this is our plan. We're coming in. We will remain on the boat. We will anchor and we will take the dinghy. I don't think they were too happy with us, but that was our only option really at that stage. We had lots of time then to discuss how we were actually going to anchor. We arrived in at about 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, so it was perfect light. There wasn't a huge amount of wind. The angle of the wind was pretty good. So we discussed the manoeuvre. Nobody had anchored under sail. It's been a long, last time I had anchored under sail was probably in my mirror dinghy. So we went through the main sailing points and the key little bits to do, and it just all sort of happened very quickly. We'd obviously gelled pretty well as a team at that stage, and sort of was amazed. Oh, we're here.
Anchor's down. It's
Anchor's
success.
down.
Sounds wonderful. Maybe we'll get you to give us an online class on how to anchor under sail under pressure with novice crew. I think we all need that skill sometimes. If you were to give someone a few words of advice before they head off across the Atlantic, what would it be?
I think lots of people say you need to prepare, and you can prepare as much as you can, but then eventually you just have to go. There's lots of things that we would have liked to be able to have, but everybody's budget is different, and I think you need to get to a level where you're comfortable with what you have. Other people are always going to have bigger and better equipment and safety equipment and sails and various different things, but once you're happy with it and you feel that you've got it enough and you're confident enough, you just have to go. So many people plan these things and never actually go then.